I mean, if it's so obvious that this retirement system doesn't really survive, why isn't anybody changing it? We want to raise the awareness that you have to take care of your money.
What we believe strongly is that financial literacy should be actually part of the education.
Money!
What Your Bank Doesn't Tell You, a podcast by UMushroom.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to our podcast, What Your Bank Doesn't Tell You. In this episode today, we're going to talk about the pension system in Switzerland, and it's a topic which is very actual, very important. Everyone should be aware of how it functions, and everyone should know what happens with the money which you are putting in the various pillars of the system, and what are you supposed to get one day. And if that's not enough, what are the alternatives which you can do in order to have a nice and decent life also in age.
Thanks, Luba, for this introduction. And indeed, the pension system is a very important topic. And as you know, we live in Switzerland, so we are kind of well aware how the system works in Switzerland. But given our research from most of the European countries or even developed countries, the system is not too different. And we are mainly talking about three pillars.
Exactly. So basically, when you start working, that's how your savings for retirement are built. You have the first pillar, which is actually called the so-called obligatory or pillar, or we can also call it the pillar which is provided by the state, right? And it has the function to make sure that the absolute bare minimum in age is covered for you. Those are literally something we call in German Existenzkosten. In English, that would be literally the bare minimum for you to kind of really buy food, potentially pay electricity, stuff like that. The second pillar would be basically the one which is provided by your employer once you started working. And that is to kind of make sure that you can continue living more or less the standard which you've been living on average during your working life. And together, the first and the second pillar are set to cover up to 60% of your living costs if you want to continue your average living standard. And then we come to the third pillar, and the third pillar is basically the one which you can kind of do on yourself, right? And that is supposed to cover on top of those 60% already provided by state and employer, that this is basically supposed to make sure that you can continue living an unchanged life as you know it on average during your active years.
Indeed, there are multiple ways how to ensure that you have a good life also in retirement. But then as well, there are plenty of voices which are assuming that this system of the three pillars, and especially the government-provided retirement plan, and to a certain extent also the retirement plan which is provided by the companies, is kind of challenged. And this also confirms when we did our research yesterday or the day before, we were Googling as well the system, how it works in other countries. And funnily enough, if you Google pension system Germany, then the first proposed question by Google is actually, when is the German retirement system going to collapse? And this says it all, right? I mean, somehow people and experts, they are assuming that under the current circumstances, the retirement systems, they don't survive. And maybe we can also say the retirement system is getting retired at some point.
We actually forgot to mention that that is the title of the podcast. It just comes to my mind, but maybe we can do it afterwards. You're right.
So, I mean, the challenges of the retirement system, of course, are the very low interest rates, which we had for quite a few years, if not almost a decade. This is changing right now with given increased interest rates, what we see right now. So the central banks, they are increasing rates. This is supporting again the retirement system. But then again, we are still at quite a low level, and we had extremely low levels for many years. Then another challenge is that people are getting older and older. I mean, to a certain extent, this is something positive because we have acquired maybe a more healthy life, we have better medical support, etc. And this allows us to get into the 90s and maybe
Still be
at some
fit.
point even into the hundreds.
Yeah.
Which is nice, but also which is kind of costly for retirement system. Another element which is challenging the retirement system is the demographic changes. So we have more elderly people in comparison to young people. Also, we have the baby boomers, so the generation which was born after the World Wars, that they are getting now retired. And this is kind of a huge population in comparison to the youth, which is currently alive. Yeah, I believe these are kind of the weak points which somehow need to be fixed in case we would like to see a very sustainable retirement system also in going forward.
That's true, and it's very important elements which you were mentioning. And the reason why we say, and when we chose this the name of the podcast, the retirement system is retired, is because of the fact that it actually does not function anymore. We are also employers, right? And we are aware what happens with the money which is actually deducted from the salaries of our of the people with whom we work, of our team and of our salaries. So what basically happens is when the money basically is deducted from our salaries for the first pillar and for the second pillar, it needs to be put somewhere. It needs to be invested. And the question is, can the respective managers of the pension funds money really create this type of return systematically over more than 50 years in order to account for, as you say, the demographic growth, the aging population, and all the other factors. And reality is, as you mentioned, that in the past 15, 20 years, we actually destroyed value because of the fact that we were having negative interest rates. But also there is also something very important, and this is the so-called redistribution effect, right, which happens. And for the first pillar, the governing principle of how money is distributed is the so-called solidarity principle. So you and I are paying actually the part of the retirements or contributing for the retirement packages of the people who are now retired. When we are retired, actually, that's going to happen as well with the people who are working back then. And it is legally for the first pillar, but actually, de facto, it happens also for the money which is in the second pillar. So basically, 60% of my income is going, I need to rely that once I'm retired in 15, 20, 30 years, those folks who actually are back then working would be capable to do that. And this is a very big question mark, right? And maybe to put some numbers for you in perspective, if you want to get, let's say, 6,000 Swiss francs per month netto as a retirement every month once you're retired, you actually are supposed to have at least 1 million in your, let's call it pension fund saving package, which you've been building up during all those years of your employment. And there are not a lot of people actually out there who have this money, right? You need to have a salary around 120, 130,000 roughly. Don't quote me, it could vary as well, but just to give you a perspective, per year on average in order to be able to actually have this. And with 6,000 Swiss francs, depending on where you live and depending on whether you're providing only for yourself or also for your family, that's not a lot, right? It can quickly kind of be eaten up depending on what kind of living standard you have.
True. I mean, you have been mentioning various very important points, but to take away, for me, the most crucial point is really that the awareness that your money paid into the second pillar pension fund, so the pension scheme which is provided by your employer is actually also using your money to actually finance the currently retired people. And this is something which you mentioned as well aware for the first pillar, for the government provided pillar, but it's not so clear, usually stated, that it's also the case for the second pillar. So the idea of you paying in and then you get the money when you are retired. This is to a large extent actually wrong. And this is also the reason why we encourage you, and we also want to support you to invest your own money in the third pillar to actually build up your wealth. And then also what you mentioned before with your example, how much you need to save to get a certain amount when you are getting retired to really reach that amount to have a very comfortable life as well.
Yes, and those numbers which we've been mentioning and discussing and preparing there's so many eventualities, right? Actually, those 6,000 per month, which we were mentioning on this example, or certain amount, whatever you need for living, even if you compute it from now on and say, I want to have this and this amount in my pension fund, let's say 1 million, 2 million, or whatever you need to secure a proper living, bear in mind there's so many uncertainties. Mm-hmm. As you say, this is the question. Are you going to have the people one day to work for that? Is the pension fund system going to produce those returns? And this is actually a very big market risk, which people are bearing completely unconsciously.
True. And one point what we didn't mention is inflation.
And inflation.
So if we have inflation, and currently we are reading in the newspapers that we have inflation even in Switzerland, where we have historically very low inflation rates, still in comparison to Europe and the US, we have still a low inflation rate. But in most of the countries, we are talking currently of an inflation around 6%. Mm-hmm. And this means your money, even if you invest it, decreases on an annual basis in value by the inflation rate, so by around 6% in most of the countries.
Yes, that's instead of the negative interest rate, you actually have it indirectly via inflation, which reduces the purchasing power. So for those out there who are actually cautious of how to build wealth, cautious of wanting to have a decent life also in age, or sustain some kind of a stable, good life over the years as you go, start investing now. Start learning to invest now. Why is that important? We can't stress it enough. There is always someone else. The way the system is structured, there is always someone else who invests for you. As we mentioned, we covered in past podcasts the fact that if you leave your cash on a bank account, it's actually the bank investing the money for you. You're invested in a currency, etc., etc. Given the fact that as you work, you actually save purposely, or you save because of the first pillar, you save for the second pillar, etc. So already the system, the state actually, and the pension fund system invest for you. So there are already two very big factors who actually determine kind of your wealth in age. And we would encourage you to also start building capital which you yourself learn how to manage. Mm-hmm. Because it's not said at the end of the day who is the better asset manager, the state, the pension fund managers, or maybe you with your skills, with your beliefs, etc.
Well, there we are getting actually also to the core part of our mission, that we are strongly convinced that if you have the basic know-how how to invest, you're always the best manager of your money, given you invest according to your very personal values. But I would like to jump slightly to the topic. And for me, the question is also, I mean, if it's so obvious that this retirement system doesn't really survive, why isn't anybody changing it? Or why are the politicians not raising it? And this is, to me, kind of surprising. But then again, if you think about it, it's also very logic. Because in case they wanted to change it, they needed to cut the retirement money for the currently retired people. So they would need to cut the pensions. And this is politically a very difficult task. So it's always easier to postpone the problem, to put it to the younger generation, because they can't complain, or they don't complain these days because they don't realize, or you don't realize that you won't get that much money in 30 or 40 years' time. So it's always easier to just get rid of the problem by postponing it. And this is something we really want to raise your awareness, and we want to raise the awareness that you have to take care of your money, take into consideration to early build up your third pillar, and we are very happy to support you there.
Yes, and it's in addition to that, what we believe strongly is that financial literacy should be actually part of the education. Again, for multiple reasons, it's not included at all. And it's essential. It's the way you should know how to move, how to have a healthy nutrition, etc., for all the reasons we've been mentioning. So the best way to provide for yourself in age is not to depend as little as possible on any financial and political system out there who is taking care of you one day. Learn best how to do it yourself, and as we can't stress enough, you're the best money manager of your wealth.
Oh, that's a beautiful closing word. I think this is it. If you have any questions or inputs, as always, write us on hello@umushroom.com. We are very much looking forward to next week to see you again and take up the next exciting topic. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Money!
What Your Bank Doesn't Tell You, a podcast by UMushroom.